October 24th, 1960. 6:45 p.m. local time. Launch Complex 41 at the Turatam test range in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, the classified rocket facility that the Soviet Union would eventually permit the world to know by the name Baikonur Cosmodrome. The autumn evening was cold, with temperatures hovering at approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and a steady wind blew across the Kazakh steppe from the northwest. Approximately 50 meters from the base of the R-16 rocket that stood fueled and waiting on the launch pad, Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces and Deputy Minister of Defense of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, sat in a white canvas folding chair smoking a cigarette and reviewing technical documents in his lap. Nedelin wore his dress uniform with all decorations visible. He had ordered them displayed. The photographs that would later be recovered from the site, taken by military photographers who would die within the next 60 seconds, showed the Marshal of the Soviet Union seated approximately 17 meters closer to the rocket than any safety protocol permitted, surrounded by a group of senior officers and engineers, working calmly on documents related to a missile that contained 130 tons of corrosive hypergolic propellants and that had been showing serious technical anomalies for the previous 48 hours. The decision to launch the R-16 before the November 7th anniversary of the October Revolution had been made personally by Nikita Khrushchev 3 weeks earlier in a meeting at the Kremlin that had included Mao Zedong, who was visiting Moscow for political consultations. Khrushchev had promised the Chinese leader a demonstration of Soviet missile capability. The R-16, designed by Mikhail Yangel's OKB-586 Bureau in Dnipropetrovsk, was the Soviet Union's first true intercontinental ballistic missile capable of being kept fueled and ready for launch over extended periods, unlike Korolev's R-7, which required hours of cryogenic fueling before each flight. The R-16 represented the future of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. It had to fly before November 7th. The political timetable did not permit negotiation. Around the rocket, approximately 250 engineers, technicians, military officers, and support personnel were working on multiple final stage problems that had emerged during the pre-launch sequence. A control system anomaly had required a reset of the flight computer 30 minutes earlier. Hypergolic propellant fumes had been detected leaking from the second stage manifold. A guidance system circuit board had been replaced 4 hours earlier and was being verified. Standard Soviet rocket safety doctrine, written in Russian language manuals that every engineer present that evening could recite from memory, required that no personnel work on a fueled rocket containing hypergolic propellants. The propellants ignited spontaneously on contact with each other. A single leak, a single arc, a single spark could initiate combustion that no human intervention could stop. The doctrine was clear. The doctrine had been ignored. Marshal Nedelin had ordered it ignored. The rocket would fly before November 7th. What none of the 250 people working around the R-16 knew, as the clock approached 6:45 p.m. on October 24th, 1960, was that the flight computer reset performed 30 minutes earlier had returned the automated launch sequencer to its pre-programmed state. In approximately 15 seconds, that sequencer would execute the instruction it had been scheduled to execute at the original launch time. It would fire the second stage engine. The engine would ignite above the fully fueled first stage. The fully fueled first stage would burst. 130 tons of hypergolic propellants would spontaneously combust at the temperature of a steel furnace, and 126 people, including the Marshal of the Soviet Union currently smoking a cigarette in his dress uniform, would die in approximately 20 seconds in what would become the worst rocket disaster in the history of human aerospace activity. The decision that placed Marshal Nedelin and his engineers in the path of the explosion had been made in Moscow approximately 3 weeks earlier, in October 1960, during a series of meetings inside the Kremlin that involved Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Chairman Mao Zedong of the People's Republic of China, and the senior leadership of the Soviet strategic rocket forces. The political context was extraordinarily delicate. Sino-Soviet relations had begun to deteriorate the previous year, following Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin and his pursuit of détente with the United States. Mao, who had begun to view Khrushchev as ideologically suspect, was openly questioning whether the Soviet Union remained committed to global communist revolution. The visit to Moscow in October 1960 was, in part, an attempt by Khrushchev to repair the relationship through a demonstration of Soviet technological prowess. The demonstration that Khrushchev had decided to offer Mao was a successful test launch of the R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile before the November 7th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The R-16 represented something the Soviet Union had not previously possessed, and that the United States, by 1960, was beginning to deploy in significant numbers. It was a missile that used storable propellants. Unlike Sergei Korolov's R-7, which used liquid oxygen and required several hours of cryogenic fueling before launch, the R-16 could remain fully fueled on its launch pad for weeks or months, ready for immediate firing in response to American attack. This capability transformed the missile from a propaganda weapon into a credible military deterrent. For Khrushchev, demonstrating the R-16 to Mao would prove that the Soviet Union remained the technological equal of the United States. For Mao, witnessing the test would either confirm Soviet strength or expose Soviet weakness. The man responsible for delivering the demonstration on the political timetable Khrushchev had established was Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin. Born in 1902 in the Voronezh region of the Russian Empire, Nedelin had risen through the Soviet artillery service during World War II, earning the rank of Hero of the Soviet Union for his command of artillery forces during the liberation of Romania in 1944. After the war, his expertise in conventional artillery had been redirected toward the new field of strategic missiles. He had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the newly created Strategic Rocket Forces in December 1959, less than a year before the events at Pad 41. Nedelin was, by all contemporary accounts, a man of personal courage and absolute political loyalty. He was also, as Boris Chertok would later write in his memoirs, a man who did not fully understand the technical reality of the weapon systems he commanded. The chief designer of the R-16, Mikhail Yangel, occupied a position in the Soviet missile hierarchy that was both prestigious and politically complicated. Yangel, 49 years old in October 1960, had spent 15 years working under Sergei Korolev at OKB-1, before being assigned to lead his own design bureau in Dnipropetrovsk in 1954. The split had been engineered by Khrushchev personally, who wanted competition between Soviet rocket design teams. Yangel's OKB-586 bureau was charged with producing storable propellant military missiles, while Korolev's OKB-1 continued to focus on cryogenic propellant space launchers. The two men were not enemies. They were former colleagues placed in structural competition by political decision. The R-16 was Yangel's first major design. Its success would establish him as Korolev's equal. Its failure would consign him to professional obscurity. On October 24, 1960, Yangel was at Pad 41, personally supervising the final preparations for the launch he could not afford to delay. The R-16 rocket that stood on Pad 41 on the evening of October 24th had been delivered to Tyuratam by rail from the Yangel Design Bureau in Dnipropetrovsk approximately 3 weeks earlier. The vehicle measured 100 feet in length, weighed 141 tons fully fueled, and consisted of 2 stages joined by an interstage skirt. The first stage carried 97 tons of propellant. The second stage carried 33 tons. The propellants themselves were the most dangerous chemical compounds routinely handled by the Soviet aerospace industry. The fuel was unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, designated UDMH, a clear liquid with a fish-like odor that ignited spontaneously on contact with oxidizers and that caused severe chemical burns on contact with human skin. The oxidizer was red fuming nitric acid, a corrosive liquid that emitted toxic nitrogen dioxide vapor at room temperature and that could dissolve most metals within hours of contact. The hypergolic combination of UDMH and red fuming nitric acid had been selected by Yangel's design team specifically because the two propellants ignited on contact without requiring any external ignition source. This eliminated the complex ignition systems that had plagued cryogenic rockets like Korolov's R-7 and that had been responsible for numerous launch failures during the 1950s. From an engineering standpoint, hypergolic propellants represented the simplest possible approach to rocket propulsion. From a safety standpoint, they represented the most dangerous fluids ever loaded into a vehicle intended to be operated by human hands. A single drop of UDMH falling onto a single drop of red fuming nitric acid would ignite spontaneously. The combination could not be transported in the same vehicle, could not be stored in the same building, could not be handled by the same personnel without explicit decontamination procedures between operations. Once both propellants were loaded into the R-16, the rocket became, in the precise technical language of Soviet safety manuals, a vehicle that could be controlled but could not be made safe. The propellant loading sequence had begun on October 22nd at 0600 hours local time. By the time fueling was completed at 1500 hours on October 23rd, the rocket had been transformed into the operational configuration that would either lift it to orbit or destroy it on the pad. Within minutes of the completion of fueling, the first technical anomalies began to manifest. A pressure sensor in the second stage oxidizer tank registered an unexpected reading. A telemetry signal from the first stage fuel manifold indicated a temperature spike. The flight computer, designated PVU for Programnoye Vremennoye Ustrojstvo, the program time device, returned an error code that the engineers monitoring the rocket had not previously encountered in ground testing. The standard procedure for an R-16 vehicle showing multiple anomalies after fueling was specified in detail in the Yangel Design Bureau's technical documentation. The rocket would be drained of propellant. The drained propellant would be returned to storage tanks. The vehicle would be removed from the pad, transported back to the assembly building, disassembled to component level, and inspected. Any defective components would be replaced. The vehicle would be reassembled, retested, and returned to the pad for a new fueling cycle. The total time required for the procedure was estimated at 5 to 7 days. The November 7th political deadline did not permit 5 to 7 days. The October 22nd to October 24th schedule did not permit 5 to 7 hours. Mikhail Yangel convened a technical conference on the morning of October 23rd inside the Pad 41 blockhouse. The conference included his senior engineers from OKB 586, the senior military officers responsible for the launch operation, and Marshal Nedelin. Yangel presented the anomalies. He recommended that the launch be postponed by 1 week to permit a full safety review. Nedelin refused. The decision Nedelin announced to the conference, recorded in the memoirs of Boris Chertok and confirmed by multiple surviving witnesses, was that the technical problems would be corrected on the pad, with the rocket fully fueled, by working through the night. The launch would proceed as scheduled. Yangel did not press the issue. The hierarchy of authority within the Soviet military-industrial complex did not permit a civilian chief designer to overrule a marshal of the Soviet Union acting on direct orders from the premier. Yangel returned to the pad and began to organize repair operations. The work that occupied Pad 41 throughout the night of October 23rd and the morning of October 24th violated every Soviet aerospace safety doctrine that had been written since 1946. Engineers worked directly on the surface of a fueled rocket, carrying 130 tons of hypergolic propellants. Welding torches were used within meters of propellant transfer lines. Electrical test equipment was operated in atmospheres that contained measurable concentrations of UDMH vapor. The number of personnel present in the immediate vicinity of the rocket exceeded by approximately tenfold the maximum permitted under standard launch protocols. Marshal Nedelin himself moved his command position from the safety blockhouse 200 meters away to a folding chair 17 meters from the base of the rocket. The position was visible from the rocket itself. Engineers working on the upper stages could see the Marshal of the Soviet Union watching them work. The intended message was clear. The Marshal was sharing their risk. The actual message, which would be understood only retrospectively, was that the Marshal did not understand what the risk was. At 6:15 p.m. local time on October 24, 1960, the engineers working on the upper stages of the R-16 rocket completed the replacement of a malfunctioning circuit board in the second stage flight control system. The replacement was the final correction required before the rocket could enter the terminal phase of the launch countdown. The flight computer, the PVU that had returned anomalous error codes throughout the previous 24 hours, needed to be reset to clear the accumulated diagnostic memory and prepare the system for the launch sequence. The reset procedure was standard. It had been performed during previous Soviet rocket tests without incident. The engineer who initiated the reset, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Nosov of the OKB 586 technical staff, had no reason to believe that the procedure carried any unusual risk. The PVU was a programmable analog computer of a type that had been designed by Soviet engineers in the late 1950s to control the sequencing of multi-stage rocket launches. It contained a mechanical drum that rotated through a fixed series of positions, with each position corresponding to a specific command in the launch sequence. The drum was driven by a clockwork mechanism that advanced one position every fixed time interval. When the drum reached a particular position, the PVU transmitted the corresponding electrical command to the rocket's various subsystems. The sequence of commands had been programmed before the rocket was placed on the pad. The PVU could not be reprogrammed in the field. It could only be reset to its starting position, or paused and resumed at its current position. What Lieutenant Colonel Nosov did not understand, what nobody at OKB 586 had thought to specifically document, was that the reset procedure he was about to execute did not return the PVU to its starting position. The reset cleared the diagnostic memory, but did not rewind the mechanical drum. The drum remained at the position it had reached during the previous countdown sequence. When the PVU was reactivated after the reset, it would resume executing commands from the position where the drum had stopped. The position where the drum had stopped, after the multiple anomalies and pauses of the previous 24 hours, was approximately 180 degrees through the launch sequence. The next command the PVU would execute was the command to ignite the second stage engine. At 6:45 p.m. local time, Lieutenant Colonel Nosov completed the reset procedure and reactivated the PVU. The clockwork mechanism began to advance. The drum rotated through 3 positions in the next 15 seconds. At the 4th position, the PVU transmitted the second stage ignition command to the RD-251 engine, mounted at the top of the second stage of the R-16 rocket. The RD-251 engine, designed by Valentin Glushko's OKB 456 Bureau, ignited as designed. The engine produced approximately 150,000 pounds of thrust at full operation, which it reached within 200 milliseconds of receiving the ignition command. The exhaust plume from the engine, traveling at approximately 7,000 feet per second, exited the engine bell directly downward into the structure of the first stage of the rocket. The first stage was fully fueled. 97 tons of UDMH and red fuming nitric acid were contained within thin-walled propellant tanks that had been designed to withstand internal pressure during flight, but had never been designed to withstand the direct impingement of a rocket engine exhaust plume at point-blank range. The first stage propellant tanks ruptured approximately 300 milliseconds after the second stage engine reached full thrust. The UDMH and red fuming nitric acid, separated by tank walls for the previous 55 hours, made contact. The hypergolic ignition that followed was not a fire in any conventional sense. It was a chemical reaction proceeding at approximately the speed of sound through 130 tons of propellant. The reaction temperature exceeded 3,000 degrees Celsius. The reaction volume expanded outward in a roughly spherical fireball that reached a diameter of approximately 120 meters within the first second of the event. Inside the fireball, the laws of biology no longer applied to the human beings working on and around the rocket. Persons within 20 meters of the rocket base were converted to vapor within the first 200 milliseconds. Persons between 20 and 50 meters were reduced to incinerated remains within the first second. Persons between 50 and 100 meters were exposed to thermal flux sufficient to cause fatal third-degree burns across the entire body surface within 3 to 4 seconds. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, seated in his white folding chair 17 meters from the base of the rocket, ceased to exist as a physical entity at approximately the same moment that the second stage engine command reached the RD-251 ignition system. The Marshal of the Soviet Union did not have time to feel the heat. He did not have time to register what had occurred. He did not have time to stand up from his chair. The cigarette he had been smoking continued to burn in the empty air for an additional fraction of a second before it too vaporized. The Tyratom test range had been equipped, on direct orders from Moscow, with an extensive system of automated cinematographic cameras designed to document every aspect of major rocket launches for subsequent technical analysis. The cameras were positioned at distances ranging from 100 meters to 2 kilometers from each launch pad, and were triggered automatically by the firing of the engines. On the evening of October 24, 1960, the cameras at Pad 41 activated at the moment the second stage engine ignited. They continued to record for the next several minutes, documenting events that the surviving witnesses would refuse to describe in detail for the remainder of their lives. The film recovered from these cameras would be classified at the highest level of Soviet state secrecy and would not be made available to historians until the partial declassification of 1989. The first 2 seconds of the recorded footage showed the formation of the initial fireball. The expansion was approximately spherical and proceeded outward from the rocket base at roughly the speed of sound. The structures within the fireball, including the rocket itself, the launch tower, the propellant transfer lines, and the personnel working in the immediate vicinity, were not destroyed in any conventional sense. They were converted into other forms of matter. The launch tower, fabricated from approximately 200 tons of steel, was reduced to molten droplets that would later be found embedded in the concrete of the pad. The rocket body, weighing 141 tons fully fueled, simply disappeared from the visual record. There was no debris in the standard sense of the word. There was only fire. The second phase of the disaster, occurring between approximately 3 seconds and 10 seconds after ignition, was the phase that the recovered film documented in detail and that surviving witnesses would later describe as the most psychologically traumatic component of the experience. The personnel working at intermediate distances from the rocket, between approximately 50 and 120 meters, were not killed instantly. They were exposed to lethal thermal radiation, but they retained consciousness and the ability to move for several seconds after exposure. The film recorded these personnel attempting to escape from the expanding fire. The Pad 41 facility was surrounded by a security perimeter fence that had been constructed to standard Soviet military specifications. The fence was approximately 2.5 meters in height and was topped with barbed wire. It had been designed to prevent unauthorized personnel from entering the secure area surrounding the launch pad. It had not been designed to permit rapid egress in case of catastrophic accident. The fence had no emergency gates within the perimeter. The standard egress routes from the pad area passed through guard stations that were now within the expanding fireball. The recovered film showed personnel running toward the perimeter fence. It showed personnel attempting to climb the fence. It showed personnel becoming caught on the barbed wire at the top. The film recorded what occurred to these personnel as the fire reached them. The surviving witnesses to the disaster, who reviewed the film during the subsequent investigation, reported that this was the portion of the footage they could not subsequently forget. The personnel attempting to escape across the fence remained visible to the cameras for the full duration of their dying. Boris Chertok, observing the disaster from a control bunker approximately 200 meters from the pad, would describe in his memoirs the cognitive process he experienced during the 20 seconds the fire required to consume the personnel within its reach. The bunker had a viewing window of armored glass. Through this window, Chertok could see the pad area clearly. What he saw, he wrote, was not initially comprehensible. He saw figures moving. He saw figures falling. He saw figures attached to the fence. After approximately 5 seconds, he began to recognize the figures. He recognized colleagues. He recognized men he had supervised. He recognized men who had attended his birthday celebration the previous month at the engineer quarters in the Cosmodrome residential complex. He recognized Lev Berlin, the chief designer of the automatic control system, who had been working at the base of the rocket and who had become visible to the cameras as a figure moving inside the fire. The recognition, Chertok wrote, was the most difficult element of the experience. It was not the dying he could not forget. It was the recognizing of the dying. The thermal output of the fireball began to decline approximately 15 seconds after the initial ignition, as the available oxidizer was consumed, and the hypergolic reaction approached chemical completion. The temperature of the pad surface remained above 1,000 degrees Celsius for the next 4 hours. Emergency response teams were unable to approach the impact area until shortly after midnight. When they did enter the area, they were not searching for survivors. They were searching for human remains in conditions where the distinction between human remains and structural debris had become, in the terminology of the subsequent forensic investigation, undefined. The fire at Pad 41 continued to burn for approximately 4 hours after the initial detonation. The residual propellants that had not been consumed in the original fireball, primarily fragments of red fuming nitric acid distributed across the pad surface and the surrounding terrain, continued to react with available fuel sources in a series of secondary combustion events. The pad surface temperature, measured by the surviving thermal monitoring equipment at the Cosmodrome Control Center, remained above 1,000 degrees Celsius until shortly after 11 p.m. local time. The first emergency response personnel were permitted to approach the inner pad perimeter at approximately 1 a.m. on October 25th, 6 hours after the explosion. What they found was not, in the conventional understanding of the word, a recovery scene. It was an archaeological site requiring forensic methods that the Soviet medical service had no prior experience in applying. The personnel who had been working within 50 meters of the rocket at the moment of the explosion had been reduced, in most cases, to remains that could not be identified by conventional means. Body recovery operations continued for the next 11 days. By November 5th, the medical teams assigned to the operation had collected what they could collect and had begun the process of attempting identification. The methods available to them included examination of personal effects that had survived the fire, dental records were available, and identification by means of unique objects associated with specific individuals. Marshal Nedelin was identified by the Gold Star Medal of the Hero of the Soviet Union, which had been fused into a deformed mass of melted metal, but which retained sufficient identifying features to be matched to the records of its issue. The official Soviet casualty count from the disaster has been a subject of historical dispute since the first declassification of the incident in 1989. The figure published in the original Ogoniok magazine article was 74 immediate deaths, with an unspecified number of additional deaths occurring in the following days and weeks from burns and toxic inhalation of nitric acid vapor. Subsequent research conducted in the post-Soviet period, based on personnel records from OKB 586 and on interviews with surviving witnesses, has produced higher estimates. The most commonly cited figure today, based on the comprehensive research published by historian Asif Siddiqi in his definitive study of the Soviet space program, is 126 total deaths attributable to the disaster, including immediate fatalities and those who died subsequently from injuries sustained at the pad. The personnel killed at Pad 41 on October 24th represented, in concentrated form, a significant percentage of the Soviet Union's most experienced engineering talent in the field of military missile development. Marshal Nedelin himself was the most politically senior figure killed, but the technical losses were equally severe. General Alexander Marikin, deputy commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces, and the man who would have succeeded Nedelin under normal circumstances, was killed at the pad. Lev Berlin, the chief designer of the automatic control system at OKB 586, was killed working at the base of the rocket. Boris Chertok, the chief designer of the guidance systems, was killed in the same area. The senior engineering staff of OKB 586 that had been assembled to supervise the launch lost approximately 40% of its members in 20 seconds. The institutional knowledge that these men had accumulated across the previous decade of Soviet missile development could not be replaced. Yangel's design bureau would require nearly 3 years to rebuild its technical leadership. Mikhail Yangel, the chief designer responsible for the R-16 and the man who had presided over the technical operations that had culminated in the disaster, was not killed at Pad 41. His survival was the result of a decision he had made approximately 30 minutes before the explosion. Yangel had retreated to a smoking shelter located approximately 150 meters from the rocket to smoke a cigarette. He had been at the smoking shelter when the second stage engine ignited. The thermal radiation from the fireball had reached the smoking shelter, but had not been sufficient to cause fatal injuries to personnel inside the reinforced concrete structure. Yangel had survived because he had wanted a cigarette. The psychological consequences of this survival defined the remaining 11 years of Yangel's life. According to multiple witnesses who worked with him during the 1960s, Yangel was never the same man after October 24, 1960. He continued to design rockets. He continued to lead OKB 586. He produced the R-36 missile that would become the backbone of the Soviet nuclear deterrent during the 1970s. But he carried, visibly, the weight of having survived an event that he believed he should not have survived. He wrote in a private diary entry recovered after his death, "I am alive because I wanted a cigarette. They are dead because I did not have the courage to tell Nedelin to stop. I will spend the rest of my life trying to balance this equation. The equation cannot be balanced. I know this. I continue trying anyway." Yangel died of a heart attack on October 25, 1971, the day after the 11th anniversary of the disaster. The news of the disaster reached the Kremlin during the early morning hours of October 25, 1960. The initial telephone report from Turatam was received by Marshal Andrei Grechko, Deputy Defense Minister, who in turn informed Premier Khrushchev at his residence outside Moscow. Khrushchev's response, according to multiple accounts assembled by historians after 1991, was characterized by an immediate political calculation rather than by any visible grief over the loss of Marshal Nedelin or the other personnel killed at Pad 41. Khrushchev understood within minutes of receiving the report that the disaster represented a propaganda catastrophe of unprecedented scale. He had promised Mao Zedong a demonstration of Soviet missile capability. He had instead presided over the largest accidental loss of life in the history of human aerospace activity. The political problem was not how to mourn the dead. The political problem was how to prevent the world from learning what had occurred. The decision to conceal the true nature of the disaster was made by Khrushchev personally during a meeting at the Kremlin on the afternoon of October 25th. The meeting was attended by Defense Minister Rodion Malinovsky, Communist Party ideology chief Mikhail Suslov, and KGB chairman Alexander Shelepin. The cover story that emerged from this meeting would be implemented across all Soviet information channels during the following 72 hours and would remain the official Soviet position on the events at Pad 41 for the next 29 years. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin had died on October 24th in an aviation accident while traveling on official duties. No other deaths were to be acknowledged. No other personnel were to be officially associated with the event. The Tyuratom test range itself, which had been a classified facility since its construction in 1955, would not be mentioned in any subsequent publication. The implementation of the cover story required the coordinated action of multiple Soviet institutions. TASS, the official Soviet news agency, published a brief obituary for Marshal Nedelin on October 26th, 2 days after the disaster. The obituary occupied 7 lines of newspaper space. It described Nedelin as a hero of the Soviet Union who had died in the performance of his duties. It identified the cause of death as an aviation accident. The obituary did not mention the strategic rocket forces, the R-16 missile, the Tyuratom facility, or any other personnel. Pravda and Izvestia carried similar brief notices on the same day. No Soviet publication carried photographs of Nedelin's funeral, which was conducted in a closed ceremony at the Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow on October 27th, attended by approximately 40 senior military officers and Communist Party officials. The handling of the families of the other 125 personnel killed at Pad 41 required a more elaborate system of compartmentalized deception. The KGB, working with the Strategic Rocket Forces Personnel Office, prepared individual notifications for each family. The notifications were not consistent with each other. Some families were informed that their relative had died in an aviation accident. Other families were informed that their relative had died during military training exercises. Other families were informed that their relative had died from natural causes during official duties. The deliberate inconsistency was intended to prevent the families from comparing notes and discovering that something larger had occurred. The strategy was successful. For the next 29 years, families across the Soviet Union mourned relatives killed in events that did not match the reality of their deaths, and these families did not, in the available historical record, ever meet each other to compare the stories they had been told. The investigation that followed the disaster was placed under the direction of Leonid Brezhnev, who at that time held the position of chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, and who 4 years later would lead the political coup that removed Khrushchev from power. Brezhnev's selection to lead the investigation was based on political reliability rather than technical expertise. Khrushchev required an investigator who could be trusted to produce conclusions that protected the political leadership rather than identifying the systemic failures that had caused the disaster. Brezhnev fulfilled this function with the bureaucratic competence that had defined his career. His final report, a classified document of 14 pages delivered to Khrushchev in mid-November 1960, identified the cause of the disaster as violations of military discipline by Marshal Nedelin and the engineering personnel under his command. The political pressure from the Kremlin to launch before the November 7th deadline was not mentioned in the report. The intelligence services of the United States detected indirect evidence of the disaster within 72 hours of its occurrence. Seismic monitoring stations operated by the United States Geological Survey registered an unusual event at coordinates consistent with the Tyuratom facility on October 24th, at approximately the time corresponding to the explosion. A Corona reconnaissance satellite passing over Soviet Central Asia on October 26th produced photographic imagery showing a discolored area at Launch Complex 41 that had not been present in previous reconnaissance photographs. Alan Dulles, Director of Central Intelligence, presented a preliminary assessment to President Eisenhower on October 30th, indicating that a significant industrial accident had occurred at the Soviet rocket facility. The assessment estimated the event as a major loss of equipment with possible casualties. The CIA would not develop a more accurate understanding of the disaster for the next 29 years. While the political dimension of the cover-up proceeded under the direction of Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow, the technical investigation of the disaster proceeded in parallel at the Tyuratam facility itself under the direction of Boris Chertok. Chertok had been transferred to the Cosmodrome on October 26th on direct orders from Khrushchev. His selection had been the result of a specific political logic. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of OKB-1 and Chertok's normal superior, had deliberately distanced himself and his bureau from the R-16 program. Korolev had viewed Yangel's storable propellant missiles as inferior engineering and had refused to permit OKB-1 personnel to participate in the R-16 development effort. Chertok had therefore been at his desk in Moscow on October 24th, rather than at Tyuratam. His absence at the moment of the disaster, combined with his technical seniority and his political reliability, made him the ideal person to investigate failures for which his own bureau bore no responsibility. Chertok arrived at Tyuratam on the morning of October 27th. The pad area was still being cleared of human remains. The thermal damage to the launch infrastructure had been so extensive that the basic geometry of the pad itself had been altered. Concrete surfaces that had been horizontal on October 23rd were tilted at angles of up to 12 degrees. The launch tower was no longer present as an identifiable structure. The propellant transfer lines had been incorporated into the molten metal that now coated significant portions of the pad surface. Chertok began his investigation by attempting to determine what had actually exploded and in what sequence. The recovery of physical evidence was limited by the extreme thermal damage. Most components of the rocket no longer existed in identifiable form. The investigation proceeded primarily through interviews with surviving witnesses. Chertok and his team conducted approximately 300 interviews during the first 10 days of the investigation. The interviews were conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy. Each witness was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement under threat of prosecution for treason. Each witness was interviewed individually, with no witness permitted to compare accounts with any other witness. The transcripts of the interviews were classified at the highest level and sealed in the archives of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, where they remained inaccessible to researchers until the limited declassification of 1989. The technical conclusion that emerged from the interviews was that the proximate cause of the disaster had been the reset of the PVU flight computer that had occurred approximately 30 minutes before the explosion. The reset had returned the flight computer to its pre-programmed sequence at a position that had triggered the ignition of the second stage engine while the rocket remained on the pad. The engineers responsible for the reset had not been aware that the procedure carried this consequence because no documentation existed that specified the behavior of the PVU under reset conditions during a paused countdown. The PVU design itself was therefore identified as containing a fundamental safety deficiency. The deeper conclusion that emerged from the interviews, the conclusion that Chertok would document in his own internal report, but that would never appear in any official Soviet publication, was that the disaster had been caused by the systematic violation of safety protocols under political pressure. The PVU design deficiency would have been a manageable technical problem if standard safety procedures had been observed. The decision to maintain personnel in close proximity to a fueled rocket showing multiple anomalies, the decision to perform repairs on a vehicle containing 130 tons of hypergolic propellants, the decision to position Marshal Nedelin and his senior staff at 17 meters from the rocket base, in violation of every protocol governing such operations, were the decisions that had transformed a technical failure into a mass casualty event. These decisions had been driven by the political requirement to launch before November 7th. The political requirement had been driven by Khrushchev's commitment to Mao Zedong. The chain of causation, traced honestly, terminated in the Kremlin. Yangel attempted to communicate these conclusions to Khrushchev directly through two private letters written during December 1960. The letters, recovered from Yangel's personal papers after his death in 1971, contained an explicit offer by Yangel to accept personal responsibility for the disaster and to resign from his position as chief designer of OKB 586. The letters also contained an implicit suggestion that the cover-up being orchestrated by the Brezhnev Commission represented a misallocation of moral responsibility that future generations of Soviet engineers would not forgive. Khrushchev did not respond to either letter. Yangel remained as chief designer of OKB 586. The Brezhnev Commission's report was finalized and sealed. The R-16 missile, despite the catastrophic failure of its initial test, was returned to development. A redesigned version of the missile successfully completed its first test launch on February 2, 1961, 3 months after the disaster. The redesigned R-16 entered operational deployment with the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces in late 1962 and became, over the following 2 decades, the most numerous intercontinental ballistic missile in the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The institutional silence that the Soviet Union maintained regarding the events at Pad 41 on October 24, 1960, was not a passive omission. It was an active and continuously maintained policy that required the cooperation of thousands of individuals across multiple decades. Every Soviet history of the space program published between 1960 and 1989 simply omitted the date. The official memoir of cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, published in 1961 and reissued in multiple editions during the subsequent decades, contained no reference to the disaster. The official biographies of Sergei Korolev, published after his death in 1966, contained no reference to the disaster. The official history of the R-16 missile, which had become a primary component of the Soviet nuclear deterrent, began with the successful test launch of February 1961. The October 1960 test that had killed 126 people did not appear in any Soviet publication for 29 years. The maintenance of the silence imposed psychological costs on the individuals who knew the truth. Boris Chertok would describe in his post-Soviet memoirs the experience of attending official commemorations of the Soviet space program throughout the 1960s and 70s, at which the public history of Soviet rocketry was rehearsed in front of audiences that included, in some cases, the widows and children of the men killed at Pad 41. The widows knew that something had happened to their husbands. They did not know what. They had been told, depending on which cover story they had received, that their husbands had died in aviation accidents, in training exercises, in unspecified incidents during official duties. They had been forbidden to discuss the circumstances of death. They attended official functions at which Chertok and other senior space program officials spoke about the heroism of Soviet rocket engineers, and they listened to these speeches without ever hearing the names of their dead. Sergei Korolev died of complications from cancer surgery on January 14, 1966. His death received the first public acknowledgement of his identity as chief designer of the Soviet space program. The obituary published in Pravda on January 16th identified Korolev by name for the first time. The obituary also contained an oblique reference, formulated in the deliberately ambiguous language of Soviet official communications, to events at Tyuratam that Korolev had observed but not participated in. The reference would later be understood, by readers who knew what they were looking for, as the first official Soviet acknowledgement that something had occurred at the Cosmodrome that the public record did not describe. The reference did not specify what had occurred. It did not specify when. It did not identify the personnel involved. It was an acknowledgement that was simultaneously a continuation of the silence. Mikhail Yangel died of a heart attack on October 25, 1971, 2 weeks after his 60th birthday. He had returned to his office in Dnepropetrovsk on the previous evening to work on the redesign of the R-36 missile that had become his bureau's primary contract following the operational deployment of the R-16. He had been observed by colleagues to be working in his customary manner. He had collapsed at his desk approximately 3 hours into the working day. The medical examination that followed identified the cause of death as myocardial infarction. The colleagues who attended his funeral, all of whom knew the events of October 24, 1960, observed among themselves that Yangel had died on the day after the 11th anniversary of the disaster. The synchronization was not accidental, in the opinion of those who had known him. Yangel had carried the weight of his survival across the 11 intervening years. The weight had eventually exceeded his cardiovascular capacity to sustain it. The Apollo-Soyuz test project of 1975 brought the first significant interaction between American and Soviet space personnel since the beginning of the Cold War. Thomas Stafford, the American astronaut who commanded the Apollo Command Module during the joint mission, visited Star City and the Baikonur Cosmodrome in the years following the mission as part of the ongoing cooperative relationship. During one of these visits, conducted in 1977, Stafford asked a Soviet cosmonaut whom he had befriended what had happened at the Cosmodrome in 1960. The cosmonaut, whose name Stafford declined to reveal in his subsequent memoir, did not answer the question. He looked at Stafford for a long moment. He shook his head. He changed the subject. Stafford understood from the response that he had asked a question that could not be answered. He did not ask it again. The silence was finally broken on April 16, 1989, when the Soviet magazine Ogoniok published a 12-page article titled "The Catastrophe at Tyuratam." The article was the work of journalist Alexander Bolosov, who had spent the previous 2 years interviewing surviving witnesses under the protections offered by Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost. The article contained the first public Soviet acknowledgement of the disaster, the first public list of the names of personnel killed at Pad 41, and the first photographs of the recovered automatic camera footage that had been classified since 1960. The publication of the Ogoniok article on April 16, 1989, produced an immediate response in Western journalism that the Soviet authorities had anticipated but had not been able to prevent. Within 72 hours of the article's publication, abbreviated translations had been transmitted by the Reuters and Associated Press wire services and had appeared on the front pages of major American and European newspapers. The Washington Post published a full English-language summary on April 19th. The New York Times published a longer analytical article on April 20th that placed the disaster within the broader context of Soviet space program secrecy. The BBC World Service produced a 30-minute radio documentary that was broadcast in multiple languages during the first week of May. For the first time since the events of October 24, 1960, an international audience received an accurate account of what had occurred at the Cosmodrome that the Soviet Union had spent 29 years pretending did not exist. The response within the United States intelligence community was more complicated than the response within Western journalism. The Central Intelligence Agency had monitored the events at Tyuratam in October 1960 through multiple technical collection systems. The seismic monitoring network operated by the United States Geological Survey had detected the explosion. The Corona reconnaissance satellite program had photographed the damaged pad. The atmospheric monitoring stations established along the Soviet borders had detected anomalous chemical residues consistent with a large-scale hypergolic propellant fire. The CIA had assembled these data points in 1960 and had reached a conclusion that captured the technical reality of the event, while completely missing its human magnitude. The Soviet Union had experienced a significant industrial accident at its rocket facility. Personnel casualties were probable but could not be quantified. When the Ogoniok article appeared in April 1989, William Webster, then serving as Director of Central Intelligence under President George Bush, ordered an internal review of the CIA's 1960 assessment of the Turatom events. The review was conducted by the Office of Strategic Research, the same component of the agency that had produced the original assessment. The review's conclusions, declassified in partially redacted form in 2013, identified the central failure of the 1960 analysis. The CIA had possessed sufficient technical data to characterize the physical magnitude of the explosion. The agency had not possessed any methodology for translating physical magnitude into estimates of human casualties at classified Soviet facilities. The number of personnel routinely working at Pad 41 had not been known. The proximity of personnel to the rocket at the moment of ignition had not been understood. The political pressure that had caused such personnel to be present at the pad in the first place had not been suspected. The CIA had assumed that the Soviet Union would observe rocket launch safety protocols comparable to those observed by NASA at Cape Canaveral. The assumption had been wrong by approximately 2 orders of magnitude. The man whose work would eventually establish the definitive historical record of the disaster was Boris Yevseyevich Chertok, who began composing his memoirs in 1991, immediately following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Chertok was 79 years old when he began the writing. He had been forbidden by his Soviet security clearances from discussing the events at Pad 41 throughout his entire professional career. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and the simultaneous expiration of the classification authority that had bound him represented the first opportunity in 31 years for Chertok to write what he had witnessed. The 4-volume work that resulted, Rockets and People, would be published in Russian between 1994 and 1999 and would be translated into English by NASA between 2005 and 2011. The 3rd chapter of the 2nd volume contained the most comprehensive account of the Nedelin disaster ever produced by a participant. The recovered footage from the automatic cameras at Pad 41, which had remained classified throughout the Soviet period, was partially released to Russian state television during the early 1990s. Excerpts from the footage appeared in documentary programs broadcast on Russian First Channel and on NTV during 1993 and 1994. The Russian public, which had received the first acknowledgement of the disaster's existence through the Ogoniok article in 1989, now saw for the first time the visual record of what had occurred. The footage was not broadcast in its full duration. The post-Soviet Russian television editors made the same decisions that the Soviet investigators had made in 1960 regarding the portions of the footage that could be shown publicly. The phases of the disaster that documented identifiable personnel dying within the fireball were not included in the broadcast versions. The footage that was shown to Russian audiences began with the formation of the initial fireball and ended with the dispersal of the smoke approximately 2 minutes later. The middle phases, the phases that Chertok had described in his memoir as the most psychologically difficult portion of his experience, remained in the classified archives. The Nedelin disaster entered the curricula of aerospace engineering programs in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan during the early 1990s, in the period following the partial declassification that had begun with the Ogoniok article. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology added the disaster to its propulsion safety case studies in 1993. The European Space Agency incorporated it into the systems engineering modules of its young graduate trainee program in 1995. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency translated Chertok's account of the disaster into Japanese for distribution to its engineering staff in 2007. By the early years of the 21st century, the events at Pad 41 on October 24, 1960, had become a standard reference point in the discipline of aerospace safety analysis. Cited alongside the Apollo 1 launch pad fire, the Challenger accident of January 1986, and the Columbia accident of February 2003. The technical lessons derived from the Nedelin disaster occupied the foreground of these case studies. The handling of hypergolic propellants in operational rocket configurations required protocols that did not permit modification under schedule pressure. The behavior of flight control computers under reset conditions during paused countdowns required documentation that specifically addressed the position of mechanical sequencers within their pre-programmed cycles. The minimum safe distance for non-essential personnel during fueled rocket operations had been formalized at 200 meters in Soviet protocols developed after 1960, and similar standards had been adopted by other space agencies. These technical lessons could be implemented within the technical infrastructure of aerospace organizations. They had been, in the decades following the disaster, the deeper lesson of the Nedelin disaster. The lesson that aerospace organizations had found significantly more difficult to incorporate into their operational practice concerned the relationship between political pressure and engineering judgment. The disaster at Pad 41 had not been caused by an unforeseen technical failure. The technical conditions that had produced the explosion had been visible to Yangel, to Chertok, and to every engineer working on the rocket during the 48 hours preceding the event. These engineers had recommended that the launch be postponed. Their recommendations had been overruled by political authority operating against political deadlines that had no engineering significance. The engineers had complied with the political authority because the structure of the Soviet system did not permit alternative responses. The compliance had resulted in the deaths of 126 people. This pattern, in which political pressure overruled engineering judgment and produced catastrophic results, had not remained confined to the Soviet space program. The Apollo 1 fire of January 27, 1967, had occurred in part because political pressure to maintain the Apollo schedule had caused NASA to accept design compromises in the command module that experienced spacecraft engineers had identified as unsafe. The Challenger accident of January 28, 1986, had occurred because political pressure to launch on schedule had caused NASA managers to overrule the engineering recommendation of Morton Thiokol that the launch be postponed due to low ambient temperatures affecting O-ring resilience. The Columbia accident of February 1, 2003, had occurred because political pressure on NASA budget and operational priorities had caused the agency to defer investigation of foam debris strikes that engineering staff had identified as a potential hazard. The technical specifics of these three American disasters differed from each other and from the events at Pad 41. The structural cause was identical in all four cases. Boris Chertok addressed this pattern explicitly in the final volume of Rockets and People, completed in 2009 when he was 97 years old. The difference between Nedelin and Apollo 1 was not in the nature of the disaster. It was in the response that followed. The Americans investigated publicly. They modified their hardware publicly. They rebuilt their program publicly. They lost public confidence for 2 years, and they recovered it. We hid. We modified in secret. We rebuilt in silence. The concealment functioned for 29 years, but when the truth eventually emerged, it destroyed more confidence than the concealment had preserved. The Americans recovered from Apollo 1 within a presidential administration. We have not recovered from Nedelin. We have not recovered from the recognition that our system would lie to its own citizens about the deaths of its own engineers for 3 decades. The lies have a compound cost. We have been paying the interest for 50 years. The informal commemoration of the disaster that emerged among the engineering personnel of the Baikonur Cosmodrome in the years following 1989 was not directed by any formal policy. It originated with individual engineers who had begun, during the late Soviet period, to leave single flowers at the site of Pad 41 on the anniversary of the disaster. As the events of October 24th became more widely known among the Cosmodrome personnel during the 1990s, the number of flowers increased. By the early years of the 21st century, The practice had stabilized at approximately 126 white flowers placed at the pad on each anniversary, one flower for each of the personnel killed. The practice was maintained by engineers who had not been alive in 1960. It continued through the political changes that followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union, through the transition of Baikonur from Russian to Kazakh territorial control, through the multiple reorganizations of the Russian space program. It continues as of the time of this account. The numerical record of the Nedelin disaster, assembled in fragmentary form across multiple sources between 1989 and the present day, describes a catastrophe whose dimensions exceeded by an order of magnitude any comparable accident in the history of human aerospace activity. The event began at 6:45 p.m. local time on October 24, 1960. The interval between the initial fault in the flight control computer and the complete consumption of the rocket and surrounding infrastructure by the hypergolic fireball was approximately 23 seconds. The diameter of the initial fireball reached 120 meters. The peak combustion temperature within the fireball exceeded 3,000 degrees Celsius. The pad surface temperature remained above 1,000 degrees Celsius for the subsequent 4 hours. The mass of propellants consumed in the reaction totaled approximately 130 tons. The total energy released by the disaster has been estimated by post-Soviet analysts at approximately 1.2 trillion joules, equivalent to the detonation of approximately 300 tons of high explosive. The human casualty figures associated with the disaster have been the subject of historical investigation continuously since the 1989 declassification. The original Ogoniok article reported 74 immediate deaths. Subsequent research has produced higher figures, as additional personnel records have been recovered from the Russian state archives, and as families of the dead have provided information not available to the original Soviet investigation. The figure most consistently cited in academic studies published since 2000 is 126 total deaths, including immediate fatalities at the pad and subsequent deaths from burns and toxic inhalation injuries during the following weeks. This figure remains an estimate rather than a confirmed total because the Soviet records of the personnel present at Pad 41 on October 24, 1960, were never fully compiled in a single document, and because some of those records have been lost during the institutional transitions that followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The actual death toll may have been higher. The Nedelin disaster represents, by any reasonable measure, the most lethal accident in the history of rocket launch operations. The Apollo 1 pad fire of January 27, 1967, killed 3 astronauts. The Soyuz 1 parachute failure of April 24, 1967, killed 1 cosmonaut. The Soyuz 11 cabin depressurization of June 30, 1971, killed 3 cosmonauts. The Challenger accident of January 28, 1986, killed 7 astronauts. The Columbia accident of February 1, 2003, killed 7 astronauts. The combined total of fatalities from all 5 of these accidents distributed across 43 years of space program operations is 21 people. The Nedelin disaster killed at least 6 times as many personnel in 23 seconds. The duration of the cover-up that followed the disaster also exceeded any comparable period of institutional silence in the history of aerospace operations. The Soviet Union maintained the official position that no significant accident had occurred at the Cosmodrome for 29 years, from October 24, 1960, until April 16, 1989. The Apollo 1 fire was publicly acknowledged within hours of its occurrence. The Challenger accident was witnessed live on television by an estimated audience of 17% of the American population. The Columbia accident was acknowledged within minutes of the loss of telemetry. None of these comparable events was subjected to institutional concealment for more than the time required to confirm the basic facts. The Soviet practice of concealing the Nedelin disaster for nearly 3 decades represented a category of institutional behavior that has no equivalent in the operational history of any other major space program. The families of the personnel killed at Pad 41 experienced the consequences of the cover-up across the full 29-year period of the concealment. The post-Soviet research conducted by Russian historians during the 1990s identified approximately 126 families that had been officially notified of relative deaths attributable to the events at Pad 41. Of these 126 families, post-Soviet researchers were able to confirm that more than 80 had lost the original recipients of the death notifications, the parents, spouses, or siblings who had been the primary mourners during the years between 1960 and 1989. These individuals had died believing the cover stories that the Soviet authorities had provided to them. They had not lived long enough to learn the actual circumstances under which their relatives had died. The monument to the victims of the disaster was constructed at Baikonur in the spring of 1990, approximately 1 year after the original publication of the Ogoniok article. The monument is a black granite obelisk approximately 3 meters in height, mounted at the perimeter of the rebuilt Pad 41 facility. The faces of the obelisk bear the inscribed names of the 126 personnel identified by the post-Soviet investigation as having been killed at the pad. 4 of the inscriptions read simply, "Unknown." These 4 entries represent personnel whose presence at Pad 41 on October 24, 1960, was confirmed by the surviving witnesses and by the personnel rosters, but whose physical remains could not be identified by any of the forensic methods available to the Soviet medical service in the weeks following the disaster. Their names were known, their remains were not. They were buried in the mass internment that had been conducted at Baikonur in November 1960 without individual identification. Boris Chertok was 82 years old when he completed the chapter on the Nedelin disaster for the 2nd volume of Rockets and People in 1996. He had outlived Marshal Nedelin by 36 years. He had outlived Mikhail Yangel by 25 years. He had outlived Sergei Korolyov, Valentin Glushko, Vasily Mishin, and nearly every senior figure of the Soviet rocket program of his generation. He was, by the time he wrote the chapter, one of the last living witnesses to the events at Pad 41 on October 24, 1960, who possessed both the technical knowledge to interpret what he had seen and the political freedom to describe it accurately. The closing passage of the chapter, written in a tone that those who knew Chertok personally described as the most somber prose he ever produced, offered the assessment of the disaster that has come to be regarded by historians of the Soviet space program as the definitive Soviet evaluation of its own institutional failure. The Nedelin disaster was not an accident. It was the logical result of a system that valued political schedules above human lives, that valued national prestige above technical prudence, that valued propaganda above truth. The system was capable of extraordinary achievements. It launched the first satellite. It launched the first human being into space. It produced rockets and aircraft and weapons that astonished our adversaries. But it was also capable of extraordinary failures, and the failures had a particular character. The failures were caused by the same political imperatives that produced the achievements. When Khrushchev decided that the R-16 had to fly before November 7th, he signed the death warrant of 126 of our best engineers. But he signed something larger than that. He signed the demonstration that our system, however capable of triumph, was not capable of honesty. When the Soviet public eventually learned what had happened 29 years later, they did not lose faith only in the space program. They lost faith in the state that had deceived them. The Nedelin disaster contributed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union no less than the stagnating economy or the wars in Afghanistan. Lies have a compound cost. For 29 years we accumulated interest. The interest came due in the autumn of 1991. The Soviet Union did not survive the bill. The deeper meaning of the disaster, as Chertok understood it, and as subsequent historians have largely confirmed, was that the Nedelin event represented something more than a single catastrophic failure within an otherwise functional system. The disaster represented the failure mode of the system itself. The Soviet rocket program had produced its successes through a combination of brilliant engineering, sustained political commitment, and the suppression of normal safety constraints under political pressure. The successes had been real. The disaster had been the inevitable byproduct of the same combination of forces that had produced them. The system that placed Yuri Gagarin in orbit in April 1961 was the same system that placed Marshal Nedelin 17 meters from a fueled R-16 rocket in October 1960. The two outcomes were not separate phenomena. They were the same phenomenon viewed from different angles. The American response to comparable failures within the United States space program had differed not in the technical specifics of the failures, but in the institutional response that followed them. The Apollo 1 fire of January 1967 had killed 3 astronauts on a launch pad in Florida. The American response had included a public investigation conducted by a board chaired by a NASA administrator, public testimony from the engineers responsible for the spacecraft, public modification of the command module hardware, and public restoration of the Apollo program over a period of 21 months. The public character of the response had been essential to its effectiveness. The American public had been permitted to observe the agency's failure, to observe the agency's correction of the failure, and to observe the agency's resumption of operations. The public observation had restored public confidence. The same public character would shape the American responses to the Challenger and Columbia accidents in 1986 and 2003. The pattern of response, repeated across 3 separate disasters spanning 4 decades, had become a defining characteristic of the American approach to aerospace failure management. The Soviet pattern of response, exemplified most completely by the Nedelin disaster, but visible also in the partial concealment of the Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 11 fatalities, had operated according to opposite principles. The disasters had been concealed. The investigations had been classified. The institutional learning that had followed the disasters, where such learning had occurred at all, had been transmitted within the technical bureaucracies through documents that were never seen by the public. The Soviet public had been deprived of the opportunity to observe its own space program's failures and the corrections that had followed them. When the disasters eventually became public knowledge, decades after the events, the revelations had not produced an effect of restored confidence. They had produced an effect of accumulated betrayal. The informal practice of leaving 126 white flowers at Pad 41 on each anniversary of the disaster continues, as of the time of this account, 66 years after the events of October 24, 1960. The personnel who maintain the practice are engineers who were not born when the disaster occurred. They have been told the story by older colleagues who were told the story by colleagues older than themselves. The transmission of the memory has proceeded through informal channels that the Soviet state never controlled, and that the post-Soviet Russian state has chosen not to interrupt. The white flowers appear at the pad each October 24th without instruction from any official authority. They have appeared every year since the partial declassification of 1989. They will continue to appear, in the expectation of those who currently leave them, for as long as the Cosmodrome continues to function. The 126 engineers who died at Pad 41 on October 24, 1960, ranged in age, according to the personnel records reconstructed after 1989, from 23 to 58 years. The median age was 34. They had been selected for their positions, in most cases through competitive examinations that had identified them as the most talented technical graduates of their generation. They represented, in concentrated form, the engineering future of the Soviet aerospace industry. On October 24, 1960, the political leadership of the Soviet Union burned that future in 20 seconds to meet a propaganda deadline. The future, once burned, did not regenerate. The Soviet space program survived the Nedelin disaster. It survived the cover-up. It survived the eventual revelation. It did not, in the opinion of those who lived through the entire arc, fully recover the institutional capability that it had possessed before the engineers at Pad 41 were sacrificed to the calendar. If this account of the Nedelin disaster brought you closer to a moment of history that the Soviet state spent 29 years pretending had never occurred, consider subscribing to Space Race Tales. Every week, we bring you the untold stories of the Cold War cosmos, the cosmonauts and astronauts who flew impossible missions, the engineers who built impossible machines, and the secrets that two superpowers spent decades hiding from the world. The space race did not end in 1972. The stories are only beginning to be told. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us for the next chapter.